The summer air hung thick and warm over Oak Valley that Saturday night in July 1986. Inside the lakeside cabin, music pulsed from a boombox while 18-year-old Jennifer Hayes laughed with her classmates, still wearing her graduation cap from the ceremony 2 weeks earlier. Her whole life stretched ahead, bright and limitless. At 11, she said her goodbyes, keys jingling in her hand as she walked to her Toyota Celica. The drive to Cedarfield was only 15 miles. She never arrived. Carol Hayes knew something was wrong before she could name it. It was the quality of the silence in the house on that Sunday morning, the way July light came through the kitchen windows and found everything exactly as they had left it the night before. Jennifer's bedroom door stood open, the bed still made with its white eyelet comforter pulled tight, the stuffed elephant from childhood sitting against the pillow. Carol stood in the doorway holding a coffee mug, steam rising into the already warming air, and felt her chest constrict. Robert Hayes was slower to worry. She probably stayed with one of the girls from the party, he said from his position at the kitchen table. Newspaper spread before him, though his eyes did not move across the words. You know how they get after graduation, talking until dawn about college and everything ahead of them. But his voice carried no conviction, and when Carol picked up the phone to start calling, he did not try to stop her. None of Jennifer's friends had seen her after she left the party. Carol worked through the list of names she had carefully written in her address book, each call the same. Jennifer left around 11, they said. She was tired, wanted to get home. She seemed fine, happy even. No, she did not mention stopping anywhere. No, she was definitely driving alone. By the 5th call, Carol's hands were shaking. By the 8th, Robert was standing beside her, his face gone gray. They got in the car without discussion. Robert drove while Carol sat rigid in the passenger seat, her purse clutched in her lap, though she could not have said what she thought she would need it for. The 15 miles between Cedarfield and Oak Valley had never felt so long. Route 49 wound through farmland and oak groves, the landscape rolling gently under the cloudless summer sky. It was the route Jennifer had driven dozens of times, the route she could navigate half asleep. They found her car at 10:30 that morning, pulled onto the shoulder about 7 miles outside Oak Valley. Robert saw it first, the familiar red Toyota Celica, and his foot hit the brakes so hard, Carol lurched forward against her seatbelt. He pulled over behind it, and they both sat for a moment, staring at the car as if it might explain itself. Carol was out first, running the few yards that separated them from their daughter's vehicle. The driver's side door hung slightly ajar. Through the window, Carol could see Jennifer's purse on the passenger seat, her graduation cap beside it, the tassel catching sunlight and throwing it back in gold flashes. The keys dangled from the ignition. Robert walked the perimeter slowly, looking for what he did not know. Damage to the paint, maybe, or signs that someone had forced their way in. But the car was pristine except for the dust of the rural road coating its panels. He crouched beside the driver's door, examining the ground. The soil was dry and hard-packed, impossible to read. When he stood again, he found Carol reaching through the open door, her hand hovering over the purse as if she might contaminate some crucial evidence by touching it. "We need to call the police," he said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, too loud in the quiet morning. Carol nodded, but did not move. She was staring at the graduation cap, at the tassel with its gold 1986 charm, and Robert watched her face crumble like something breaking in slow motion. The Oak Valley Sheriff's Department arrived within 20 minutes of Robert's call. 2 deputies first, their patrol car kicking up dust as it pulled behind the Hayes vehicle, then Detective Frank Morrison 15 minutes later in an unmarked sedan. Morrison was 47 years old, a 20-year veteran of the department, with a thick mustache and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything. He approached the Toyota Celica with his hands in his pockets, careful not to touch anything until the photographer arrived. "Tell me about your daughter," he said to Carol and Robert, who stood together now in the shade of an oak tree, neither able to bear looking at the car anymore. Carol spoke while Robert stared at the ground. Jennifer was 18, graduated from Cedarfield High 2 weeks ago, planning to attend UC Berkeley in the fall. She was responsible, careful, never stayed out without calling. Last night, she had been at a graduation party at the Morrison Lake cabin, you know the one, off Cedar Point Road. She left around 11 to drive home. She should have been there by 11:20 at the latest. Morrison wrote everything in a small notebook, his handwriting cramped and efficient. Did she have any problems? Boyfriend troubles? Arguments with friends? Anything that might have upset her? Carol shook her head vehemently. Jennifer was happy. She was excited about college. She and Mark Sutton had been dating casually, but there was nothing serious there, nothing that would make her upset. She had no reason to run away if that is what you are thinking. Morrison looked up from his notebook. I am not thinking anything yet, ma'am. I am just gathering information. He turned to one of the deputies. Get crime scene out here. I want photographs of everything, and I want this car processed before we move it. The photographer arrived, a young woman named Sandra Chen, who moved around the Toyota Celica with practiced efficiency, her camera clicking steadily. Morrison walked the area in expanding circles from the vehicle, looking for tire tracks, footprints, anything that might tell him what happened here. The road was quiet, no houses visible in either direction, just the oak groves and dry grass stretching away under the July sun. It was one of the deputies, a kid named Patterson, who had only been on the force 6 months, who found the cigarette butt. It was on the driver's side of the vehicle, partially ground into the dirt shoulder about 3 feet from where the door hung open. Morrison crouched beside it, studying it without touching it. The cigarette was a Marlboro Red, smoked down to the filter, the paper stained and dirty but not weathered enough to have been there long. Get this bagged, Morrison called to Chen, and photographs before we touch it. Check for prints on the filter. Could be from anyone, Patterson said, hovering behind Morrison's shoulder. Could have been there for days. Morrison shook his head. Look at it. No rain damage, paper is still relatively intact. This was dropped recently, maybe last night. He stood, his knees cracking. Bag everything within a 10-foot radius of this vehicle. Cigarette butts, bottle caps, anything that does not look like it belongs. By early afternoon, the Toyota Celica had been loaded onto a flatbed truck and taken to the impound lot behind the sheriff's department for more detailed processing. Morrison sent deputies to the party location to interview witnesses. Carol and Robert returned to Cedarfield, to their empty house, where Jennifer's absence filled every room like smoke. The witness interviews began that same afternoon and stretched into Monday. Detective Morrison drove to Oak Valley, to the lake cabin where 24 teenagers had gathered Saturday night to celebrate the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The cabin belonged to the Morrison family, no relation to the detective, who had been generous enough to let their son David host the party, with the understanding that there would be no alcohol and everyone would be home by a reasonable hour. Morrison sat in the cabin's living room, still smelling faintly of spilled soda and the synthetic butter from microwave popcorn, and interviewed the party guests one by one. They came with their parents, nervous and eager to help. Most told the same story. The party had been mellow, no drama, no fights, music and dancing, and a lot of talk about college plans. Jennifer had been in good spirits, maybe a little quiet toward the end of the evening, but nothing concerning. She left alone around 11, said she was tired and wanted to get home. David Porter, 19 and heading to community college in the fall, sat across from Morrison with his hands clenched between his knees. I should have walked her to her car, he said. I should have made sure she got out okay. Morrison looked up from his notes. Did you see her get in her car? Yeah, I was outside, talking to some people. She waved when she left. Did you see any other cars leave around the same time? David hesitated. There was a truck, I think. Dark colored, maybe blue or black. It pulled out of the lot maybe a minute after Jennifer left. But I don't know if it was following her or just happened to be leaving at the same time. Morrison's pen stopped moving. You sure about this? A dark truck? Pretty sure. It was an older model, 80s maybe, with a loud engine, but I was not really paying attention. I was drunk, to be honest. Not like wasted, but I had been drinking beer and I was not thinking clearly. Did you tell this to the deputies who came yesterday? David's face flushed. No. I did not think about it until later, and then I was not sure if I really saw it or if I am just imagining things now because I feel guilty. Morrison made a note to follow up on the truck, though he knew the chances of tracking down a dark pickup based on such a vague description were minimal. How many trucks like that were there in the county? Hundreds, easily. Still, it was something. The forensic processing of Jennifer's Toyota Celica took 3 days. Technicians dusted for fingerprints, finding dozens of overlapping prints belonging to Jennifer, her parents, Mark Sutton, and several friends who had ridden in the car over the past months. They vacuumed the interior for fibers and trace evidence, cataloged every item in the vehicle. The gas tank was 3/4 full. The engine showed no signs of mechanical failure. There was no note, no indication that Jennifer had planned to disappear. The purse yielded Jennifer's wallet with $42 in cash, her driver's license, a student ID card from Cedarfield High, and several photographs of friends. There was a tube of lipstick, a pack of gum, car keys, and a small notebook where she had written what appeared to be a packing list for college. Towels, desk lamp, notebooks, the list read in Jennifer's careful handwriting. At the bottom, she had drawn a small smiley face. Morrison interviewed Mark Sutton on Tuesday afternoon at the Sutton family home in Cedarfield. Mark was 19, working at his father's hardware store for the summer, before starting at the State University in the fall. He sat in the living room with his parents flanking him on the couch, their faces tight with concern. "Jennifer and I were not serious," Mark said when Morrison asked about their relationship. "We went to prom together and hung out sometimes, but we both knew we were going to different colleges. There was no drama, no breakup, nothing like that." "When was the last time you saw her?" "At the party Saturday night. We talked for a while, danced a little. She left before I did. I stayed until maybe 1 in the morning." Morrison verified Mark's alibi with 6 other partygoers. The kid had been visible and accounted for all night. Whatever happened to Jennifer Hayes, Mark Sutton had not been there when it did. On Wednesday, Morrison drove to Cedarfield High School to speak with Jennifer's teachers and the school administration. The building was closed for summer, but the principal, a woman named Eleanor Vance, met him in her office that still smelled of floor wax and the particular institutional scent of schools everywhere. "Jennifer was one of our best students," Vance said, pulling Jennifer's file from a cabinet. "She had a 4.2 GPA, was editor of the yearbook, volunteered as a tutor. Her teachers uniformly loved her. Responsible, mature, kind to other students." "Any problems we should know about?" Morrison asked. "Conflicts with other students? Inappropriate attention from anyone?" Vance shook her head. "Nothing. Jennifer was not the type to attract drama. She kept her head down, focused on her work." "What about staff? Anyone pay unusual attention to her?" "Detective, this is a small school. Everyone knows everyone. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that our staff are professionals. If there had been anything inappropriate, I would have known about it." Morrison left the school with a list of Jennifer's teachers and the maintenance staff who worked in the building during the school year. He would interview them all, though he suspected he would find nothing. Cases like this, the answer was almost never complicated. A young woman broken down on a rural road, someone stopped, someone with bad intentions. The trick was finding out who. The cigarette butt sat in an evidence bag on Morrison's desk. The Marlboro Red filter stained brown with nicotine and something else, possibly saliva. He had sent it to the state lab for analysis, though in 1986, the technology for extracting useful information from such evidence was limited. They could test for blood type if there was enough saliva, maybe get lucky with a fingerprint on the paper. But DNA analysis was still years away from practical application in criminal investigations. Search parties formed organically in Cedarfield and Oak Valley. Volunteers walked the fields and groves along Route 49, calling Jennifer's name until their voices gave out. They searched abandoned buildings and irrigation ditches, anywhere a body might be hidden or a person might have crawled if injured. They found nothing. By the end of July, the tips were coming in but leading nowhere. Someone thought they saw Jennifer at a rest stop near Sacramento. A trucker called to say he picked up a hitchhiker matching her description. A psychic from San Francisco sent a letter describing a vision of Jennifer in a cabin in the mountains. Morrison followed every lead, driving hundreds of miles, interviewing dozens of people. Nothing connected. Nothing made sense. The media coverage swelled and then began to recede. Missing graduate was replaced by other headlines, other tragedies. The Hayes family appeared on the local news, Carol's face drawn and pale as she begged anyone with information to come forward. "We just want our daughter back," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, if you know anything at all, please call." The phone at the Hayes house rang constantly for weeks. Most calls were well-meaning but useless. Some were cruel. One man called to say he had Jennifer and would return her for $10,000. Robert reported the call and police traced it to a payphone in Fresno. The caller was never identified. Detective Morrison became increasingly obsessed with the case as summer turned to fall. He kept Jennifer's photograph on his desk, her graduation picture, where she smiled at the camera with her whole future ahead of her. At night, he drove Route 49, trying to see what Jennifer had seen, trying to understand what happened in those missing minutes between leaving the party and her car being found abandoned. The detail that haunted him was the cigarette butt. Someone had stood beside that car, smoking, waiting or watching, or doing something that required them to pause long enough to finish a cigarette. The butt had been dropped carelessly, ground into the dirt with a heel. That suggested someone comfortable, someone not worried about being seen, or someone who did not care. But without more evidence, without a body or a witness or a confession, there was nothing Morrison could do. The case file grew thicker with dead ends and unanswered questions. By December 1986, it was quietly transferred to the inactive cases, though Morrison never really let it go. He kept working it in his spare time, kept making calls, kept hoping for the break that never came. The Cedarfield community held a candlelight vigil in December, 6 months after Jennifer vanished. Hundreds of people gathered in the town square, holding candles against the winter darkness. Carol and Robert Hayes stood at the center, their faces hollow with grief and exhaustion. People said kind things, made promises about never forgetting, but everyone knew the truth. Jennifer Hayes had disappeared into the vast indifference of the world, and chances were good she would never be found. The house in Cedarfield became a mausoleum. Carol Hayes moved through rooms that echoed with absence, her daughter's presence both everywhere and nowhere at once. Jennifer's bedroom remained untouched, frozen in the summer of 1986. The white eyelet comforter stayed pulled tight across the bed. The posters on the walls, bands and movie stars that 18-year-olds cared about that year, curled slightly at the edges as months became years. The stuffed elephant sat against the pillow, its button eyes catching light from the window that looked out onto the street where Jennifer used to park her red Toyota Celica. Carol went into that room every morning. She sat on the edge of the bed and spoke to the silence. She told Jennifer about the weather, about what was happening in town, about the garden she could not bring herself to plant that first spring. Sometimes Robert found her there in the afternoon, still sitting, still staring at the shelves lined with yearbooks and the framed photographs of Jennifer at various ages. Baby Jennifer, gap-toothed and smiling. Jennifer at 10 in her soccer uniform. Jennifer at graduation, cap and gown, her whole future ahead of her. Robert threw himself into his work at Cedarfield High School. He had been a history teacher there for 15 years, beloved by students for his dry humor and the way he could make the past feel immediate and real. But after Jennifer disappeared, something shifted in him. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He no longer ate lunch in the faculty lounge with the other teachers. He stopped attending school events outside of required functions. His colleagues noticed how he had aged, how his shoulders curved inward as if carrying invisible weight. In the classroom, he was still competent, still prepared, but the spark was gone. Students whispered about it, about Mr. Hayes, whose daughter vanished, about how sad he looked when he thought no one was watching. Some of them had known Jennifer, had been in classes with her. They did not know what to say to him, so they said nothing, and Robert was grateful for their silence. The first anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance came in July 1987. Carol marked the day by driving to the spot on Route 49 where Jennifer's car had been found. She brought flowers, white roses because those had been Jennifer's favorite, and laid them on the shoulder of the road. She stood there for an hour in the summer heat, cars passing occasionally, drivers slowing to stare at the woman standing alone by the roadside. She did not care. This was where her daughter had last been, or at least where the last trace of her had been found. This spot had become a kind of shrine. She would return every year on July 13th, always with white roses, always standing in that same spot. The ritual became known in the community. People in Cedarfield and Oak Valley would see Carol Hayes on the shoulder of Route 49, and they would know what day it was. Some would honk gently as they passed, a gesture of acknowledgement or sympathy. Most just drove by, uncomfortable with the raw grief of a mother who refused to stop searching. Amanda Hayes had been 14 when her sister disappeared. She was 21 now in 1993, living in an apartment in Sacramento, working as a paralegal and trying to build a life separate from the tragedy that defined her family. She came home once a month, driving the 2 hours to Cedarfield with a sense of obligation that felt increasingly heavy. The house oppressed her, the way time had stopped inside it, the way her mother orbited Jennifer's empty bedroom like a planet circling a dead star. She loved her parents, but she could not breathe in that house anymore. Every conversation eventually circled back to Jennifer. Every meal was eaten with the awareness of the empty chair. Amanda had her own memories of her sister, complicated ones that no one wanted to hear. Jennifer had been demanding sometimes, critical of Amanda's choices, impatient with her younger sister's interests. They had fought like sisters do. But you could not say that after someone disappeared. You could not admit that your relationship had been anything other than perfect, because that felt like betrayal. So Amanda smiled and nodded when her mother talked about Jennifer's plans for college, about the things she would have accomplished, about how bright her future had been. She hugged her father when he looked like he might collapse under the weight of his grief. And then she drove back to Sacramento and felt guilty for the relief that flooded through her when she crossed the county line. Detective Frank Morrison retired in 1995 after 30 years with the Oak Valley Sheriff's Department. He was 62 years old, his health failing, his marriage strained by decades of bringing work home. But before he left, he made sure to visit the Hayes family one last time. He sat in their living room, the same living room where he had delivered updates and dead ends for 9 years, and he told them the truth. "I never stopped thinking about Jennifer," he said. His voice was rougher now, worn down by cigarettes and disappointment. "I worked every lead, followed every tip. I wish I could tell you that we were close to finding answers, but I cannot. The case is still open. It will always be open until we know what happened to her." Carol sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She was 53 years old but looked older, her hair completely gray, her face lined with years of not sleeping well. "Thank you for trying," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost toneless. "We know you did everything you could." After Morrison left, Robert said what they were both thinking. No one is looking for her anymore. Not really. They have moved on to other cases, other missing people. Jennifer is just a file in a cabinet now. Carol did not argue because she knew he was right. The late 1990s brought renewed hope in the form of new technology and national attention to cold cases. America's Most Wanted featured Jennifer's case in 1998, a 5-minute segment that included her graduation photo and a reconstruction of her last known movements. The program generated hundreds of calls to the tip line. People claimed to have seen Jennifer in Oregon, in Nevada, in Texas. One woman called to say Jennifer was living in her apartment building in Phoenix, working as a waitress under an assumed name. Every lead was investigated. Every lead went nowhere. The woman in Phoenix was not Jennifer. The sightings were cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. Carol flew to Phoenix anyway, drove to the apartment building, waited outside until she saw the woman. She was the right age, had similar coloring, but when Carol looked at her face, she knew immediately it was not her daughter. She sat in her rental car in the parking lot and cried until she could not breathe. The reinvestigation in 1998 brought new detectives to the case, younger officers who had not been there in 1986. They reviewed all the evidence with fresh eyes, looking for something the original investigators might have missed. They re-interviewed witnesses who could still be found. David Porter, now 31 and married with 2 children, told the same story he had told 12 years earlier. There was a truck, dark-colored, leaving around the same time as Jennifer. He still was not sure if it meant anything. The cigarette butt was re-examined. In 1998, DNA technology had advanced significantly from where it had been in the mid-80s. The lab extracted a partial DNA profile from the saliva on the filter. It was not complete enough for CODIS, the FBI's national database, but it was enough to potentially match against a suspect if they ever found one. The profile went into the case file, another piece of evidence waiting for context. But there were no suspects. There had never been suspects. Not really. The investigation had generated persons of interest, men with criminal records who lived in the area, registered sex offenders, anyone who might fit the profile of someone who would abduct a young woman. All had been interviewed, all had been cleared, or could not be connected to Jennifer in any meaningful way. Carol started a support group in 2000, meeting monthly in the community room at the Cedarfield Public Library. It was for families of missing persons, people trapped in the same terrible limbo of not knowing. They came, a dozen at first, then 20, sharing stories that were all variations on the same theme. Someone was here and then they were not. The police tried, but the trail went cold. The waiting became its own kind of death. Carol found purpose in the group. She could not find her own daughter, but she could sit with other mothers and fathers and siblings and let them know they were not alone in their grief. She became an advocate, writing letters to state legislators about funding for cold case investigations, about the need for better resources for families of missing persons. She appeared at city council meetings, at county supervisor hearings, always dressed neatly, always composed, always asking the same questions. What are you doing for the missing? What are you doing for the families left behind? Robert Hayes died on a Tuesday in March 2008. He was 69 years old. The death certificate listed cardiac arrest, but Carol knew better. He had died of a broken heart, of 22 years carrying the weight of not knowing what happened to his daughter. They had found him in his study at home, slumped over his desk, where he had been grading papers. On the desk beside him was a photograph of Jennifer at her high school graduation, the same photograph that had been in the newspapers, that had been shown on America's Most Wanted, that had been photocopied and distributed on flyers throughout Northern California. The funeral was well attended. Former students came, colleagues from the high school, members of Carol's support group. Amanda flew in from Portland, where she lived now with her husband and 2 daughters. She stood beside her mother at the graveside service and wondered how Carol would survive this new loss layered on top of the old one. But Carol did survive, the way she had survived everything else. She was 66 years old now and alone in the house in Cedarfield. The silence was different without Robert, heavier somehow. She moved through her days with a routine that kept her tethered to the world. Monday was grocery shopping. Tuesday was the support group meeting. Wednesday, she volunteered at the library. Thursday, she drove to Route 49 and left flowers. The rest of the week, she filled with whatever needed doing. Amanda called every Sunday evening. The conversations followed the same pattern. How are you doing, Mom? I am fine, sweetie. Are you eating enough? Yes, I am eating. Have you thought about selling the house? Maybe moving closer to us in Portland? No, I cannot leave. What if Jennifer comes back and I am not here? Amanda stopped suggesting her mother move. She understood that Carol would live in that house until she died, waiting for a daughter who was almost certainly dead, who had been dead for decades. It was not rational, but grief was not rational. Love was not rational. Hope, the cruelest emotion, was not rational at all. The house in Cedarfield held its ghosts and its silence, and Carol Hayes, who moved through it like a ghost herself. Jennifer's room remained frozen in 1986. The white eyelet comforter, the posters, the stuffed elephant, the yearbooks on the shelf. The photographs of a girl who would be 44 years old now if she had lived, but who would forever be 18 in Carol's memory, forever smiling in her graduation cap, forever about to drive home on a summer night, and never arriving. The years accumulated like dust. 2009, 2010, 2015. Technology advanced. The world changed. The cold case unit in Oak Valley was established with federal grant money. Young detectives with new tools looked at old crimes. But Jennifer Hayes remained missing, her case a file that got thicker but never closer to resolution. In 2014, a documentary filmmaker contacted Carol about featuring Jennifer's case in a series about unsolved disappearances. Carol agreed, hoping that new exposure might generate new leads. She sat for interviews in her living room, the camera pointed at her face that showed every one of her 72 years. She told Jennifer's story again, the same story she had told hundreds of times. The responsible daughter, the bright future, the summer night, the abandoned car, the decades of not knowing. The documentary aired in early 2015 on a cable channel specializing in true crime. It was well produced, sympathetic. Carol's phone rang for a week afterward with people offering condolences and theories. None of the theories led anywhere. None of the tips panned out. The attention faded as quickly as it had come. Carol was 73 now, her health declining. She had developed diabetes, high blood pressure, the accumulated insults of aging and stress. Amanda worried constantly, called more frequently, begged her mother to move to Portland, but Carol refused. She could not leave Cedarfield. She could not abandon Jennifer's room, or the ritual of the flowers on Route 49, or the hope, however thin and worn, that someday she would know what happened to her daughter. I just want to bury her, Carol told Amanda during one of their Sunday phone calls. Her voice was tired, defeated in a way Amanda had never heard before. I just want to know where she is so I can bury her beside your father. I want to say goodbye properly. Is that too much to ask? Amanda sat in her kitchen in Portland, tears streaming down her face, and had no answer. It was not too much to ask. It was the most basic human need, to know, to grieve properly, to let go. But Jennifer Hayes remained lost in the terrible space between alive and dead, and her mother remained trapped in that space with her, unable to move forward, unable to let go, unable to do anything but wait. Detective Sarah Chen was 35 years old when she was assigned the Jennifer Hayes case in the spring of 2022. She had joined the Oak Valley Sheriff's Department 5 years earlier after working cold cases in San Jose, drawn by the challenge of unsolved crimes and the promise of advanced training in forensic genetic genealogy. The cold case unit had been established with federal grant money, a 3-person team tasked with reviewing every unsolved disappearance and homicide in the county dating back to the 1970s. There were 43 cases in total. Jennifer Hayes was number 17 on the list. Chen spent the first week reading through the file. It was thick, bloated with decades of dead ends and false leads. She read Frank Morrison's original reports, meticulous and thorough. She read the witness statements from the graduation party, the interviews with Jennifer's family and friends, the tips that had come in over the years. She studied the photographs of the abandoned Toyota Celica, the close-ups of Jennifer's purse and graduation cap sitting on the passenger seat. She read about the searches, the vigils, the years of Carol Hayes driving to Route 49 with white roses. What caught Chen's attention was the cigarette butt. The Marlboro red filter that had been found near the driver's side door, ground into the dirt as if someone had stood there smoking while they waited or watched or did something that required them to pause. The evidence had been processed in 1998 when DNA technology had advanced enough to extract a partial profile. That profile sat in the file, a string of genetic markers that had never matched anything in CODIS. But forensic genetic genealogy had changed everything. The technique that had caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, that had solved dozens of cold cases across the country, used DNA profiles to identify distant relatives through public genealogy databases. From those relatives, investigators could build family trees, narrowing down possibilities until they found a suspect. It was painstaking work, more genealogy than detective work, but it was effective. Chen called the state forensic lab on a Monday morning in June. She spoke to a technician named Robert Martinez who specialized in DNA analysis. "I need you to look at evidence from a 1986 case," she said. "A cigarette butt with a partial DNA profile. I want to know if there is enough genetic material to run through genealogy databases." Martinez called her back 3 days later. "We extracted additional DNA using new amplification techniques," he said. "The original analysis in '98 only captured about 60% of the profile. We have got closer to 85% now. It is not complete, but it should be enough for genealogical searching." Chen submitted the profile to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA in July. These were public databases where people uploaded their genetic information to find relatives and trace their ancestry. Law enforcement could search the databases under specific protocols, looking for matches that might identify suspects in serious crimes. The process was slow, algorithmic, searching through millions of profiles for distant genetic connections. The first match came back in early August. A third cousin, someone who shared a great-great-grandparent with the person who had smoked that cigarette in 1986. Then another match, a fourth cousin. Then a cluster of matches all related through a family line that traced back to German immigrants who had settled in Northern California in the 1890s. Chen felt something quicken in her chest. This was the thread she needed to pull. She reached out to Barbara Reed, a genetic genealogist who had worked with law enforcement on several high-profile cases. Reed was 62, a former librarian who had discovered a talent for untangling family trees and had built a second career helping police solve cold cases. She agreed to consult on the Hayes case pro bono, intrigued by the challenge. For 6 weeks, Chen and Reed worked together, building family trees from the DNA matches. They started with the known relatives in the databases and worked backward through generations, using birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, obituaries, anything that documented family connections. They traced lines through Northern California, following families as they moved from Sacramento to Stockton to Modesto to the smaller towns scattered through the agricultural valleys. The trees grew sprawling and complex, branches splitting and rejoining as cousins married and families intertwined. Reed worked from her home office, sending Chen updates several times a day. "I have got another connection through the Mueller line," she would write. Or, "The Patterson family connects to the Schmidts in 1892, that gives us another data point." Chen pinned printed family trees to the wall of her office, drawing lines in red marker, trying to see the pattern. By late September, they had narrowed the pool to 3 families, all with roots in the Cedarfield and Oak Valley area. From those families, they identified males who would have been the right age in 1986, who had lived in the area, who could have been on Route 49 that July night. One had died in 2003. Another had been in prison in 1986 on an unrelated charge. That left one name, Thomas William Garrett. Chen ran Garrett's name through every database available. He was 89 years old, born in 1933 in Rockford, Illinois, moved to California in 1958. He had worked various jobs over the decades, most recently as maintenance supervisor at Cedarfield High School from 1972 until his retirement in 2005. Chen felt her pulse quicken when she read that. Cedarfield High, where Robert Hayes had taught, where Jennifer Hayes had been a student. Garrett's record was clean. No arrests, no criminal history, nothing that would have flagged him as a person of interest. He had been married to Linda Garrett from 1974 until her death from cancer in 2019. No children. He lived alone now in a small house on Maple Street in Cedarfield, 3 blocks from where the Hayes family had lived. He had been there all along, had lived in that town for 37 years after Jennifer disappeared, invisible and unremarkable. Chen pulled Garrett's employment records from the school district. As maintenance supervisor, he had access to every building on campus, worked irregular hours, often stayed late or came in on weekends. She requested his DMV records. In 1986, he had owned a 1982 Ford F-150, dark blue. Chen thought of David Porter's statement from 37 years ago about the dark truck leaving the party around the same time as Jennifer. She began interviewing people who had known Garrett, starting with former colleagues from the high school. Most were retired now, some had died, but she tracked down 5 people who had worked with him. They all said essentially the same thing. Tom Garrett was quiet, competent, kept to himself. He did his job well, never caused problems, seemed like a decent guy. One woman, a former secretary named Ruth Collins, added something else. "He always seemed to be watching people," she said. "Not in an obvious way, but I noticed it. He would be working on something and his eyes would be on the students, especially the girls. It made me uncomfortable, but I never said anything, because he never did anything wrong that I could see." Chen needed more evidence before she could make an arrest. A DNA match through genetic genealogy was suggestive but not definitive in court. She needed to place Garrett at the scene, needed to connect him directly to Jennifer. She applied for a search warrant, arguing that Garrett was a suspect in a 37-year-old murder case based on genetic evidence and circumstantial connections. The judge granted the warrant on October 10, 2022. The search of Garrett's house took place on a Wednesday morning. Chen arrived with a team of 4 officers and 2 forensic technicians. Garrett answered the door in pajama pants and a cardigan, his face creased with sleep and confusion. "Thomas Garrett?" Chen held up her badge. "I am Detective Sarah Chen with the Oak Valley Sheriff's Department. We have a warrant to search your property." Garrett's face went pale. He stepped back without speaking, one hand clutching the doorframe. Chen watched his reaction carefully. Fear, yes, but something else too. Recognition, maybe. As if he had been waiting for this moment for 37 years. The search was thorough and systematic. Officers went through every room, every closet, every drawer. Forensic technicians photographed everything, collected potential evidence in paper bags and sealed containers. In the garage, they found tools, old paint cans, boxes of Christmas decorations. In a storage shed behind the house, they found more boxes, most filled with junk accumulated over decades. One box contained work clothes from Garrett's years at the high school, including several pairs of work boots. Chen pulled out each pair of boots, examining them. Most were newer, purchased in the last 10 or 15 years. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, was an older pair. Red Wing boots, size 11. The leather cracked and dried with age, but the tread pattern still visible. Chen felt electricity run through her. She bagged the boots carefully, labeled them, added them to the evidence pile. They brought Garrett to the sheriff's department for questioning that afternoon. He sat in the interview room with his hands folded on the metal table, his face gray and deeply lined. Chen sat across from him, Detective Marcus Thompson beside her. Thompson was 52, a 25-year veteran who specialized in interrogation. Between them, they had interviewed hundreds of suspects. They knew how to read body language, how to listen for the telling hesitation, how to wait through silence until people filled it with truth. "Mr. Garrett," Chen said, keeping her voice neutral and professional, "we are investigating the disappearance of Jennifer Hayes in 1986. Do you remember hearing about that case?" Garrett's hands tightened slightly, the only visible reaction. "I remember," he said. His voice was thin, reedy with age. "It was in all the papers. The girl who went missing after graduation. You worked at Cedarfield High School at that time. Is that correct?" "Yes, I was maintenance supervisor." "Did you know Jennifer Hayes?" A long pause. Garrett's eyes moved to the two-way mirror, then back to Chen. "I knew who she was. I knew all the students, at least by sight. It was my job to be around the building." Chen opened a folder, pulled out a photograph. "This is the evidence we recovered from the scene where Jennifer's car was found. A cigarette butt, Marlboro Red. We extracted DNA from it." She paused, watching Garrett's face. "That DNA matches your family line, Mr. Garrett. Through genetic genealogy, we traced it back to you." Garrett said nothing. His jaw worked as if he were chewing something. "We also found boots in your storage shed," Chen continued. "Red Wing work boots, size 11. The same size and brand that left a partial print near Jennifer's car. We are going to compare those boots to the print we have on file." She leaned forward slightly. "This is your chance to tell us what happened. 37 years is a long time to carry something like this." "I want a lawyer," Garrett said. His voice was barely audible. "That is your right," Chen said. She stood, Thompson following. "But before we go, I want you to think about Carol Hayes. She is 79 years old. She has spent 37 years not knowing what happened to her daughter. Every day of those 37 years, she has wondered if Jennifer is alive somewhere, if she is suffering, if she is thinking about home. That kind of not knowing destroys people. If you have any decency, any conscience at all, you will think about that." They left Garrett in the interview room. Chen knew he would not talk, not without his lawyer present. But she had planted the seed. Sometimes that was enough. Garrett's attorney, a public defender named James Walsh, arrived within 2 hours. He was 43, overworked and underpaid, handling a caseload that would have broken most people. He met with Garrett privately for 30 minutes, then requested another interview with Chen and Thompson present. They reconvened in the same interview room. Walsh sat beside Garrett, a legal pad in front of him covered with notes. "My client is willing to make a statement," Walsh said, "but we need to discuss terms first. He is 89 years old, in declining health. If he cooperates fully, if he tells you what happened and where to find Jennifer Hayes, we want consideration in sentencing." Chen exchanged a look with Thompson. "That is up to the DA," she said, "but cooperation is always noted. If your client has information about Jennifer Hayes, now is the time to share it." Garrett's hands trembled on the table. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet, Chen had to lean forward to hear. "It was an accident," he said. "I did not mean for it to happen that way." Chen activated the recording equipment, stated the date and time and who was present. "Mr. Garrett, can you tell us what happened on the night of July 12, 1986? Garrett took a shaky breath. "I was driving home from town, heading south on Route 49. It was late, maybe 11:30 or so. I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder, the hood was up. A girl was standing beside it, looking at the engine. I recognized her from the school. Jennifer Hayes." "You stopped to help her?" Chen asked. "I stopped," Garrett said. His eyes were fixed on the table. "I asked if she needed help. She was hesitant at first, but she knew me from school, so she said yes. I looked under the hood, told her I thought it was the alternator, but I was not sure. I said I had tools in my truck, that I could try to fix it." "What happened then?" Garrett's face crumpled. "I do not know what came over me," She was so young, so pretty, standing there in the dark, trusting me to help her. Something just snapped. I had been thinking about her for months, watching her at school. I had these thoughts, these fantasies, and suddenly she was right there, and no one else was around. Chen felt nausea rise in her throat, but kept her expression neutral. "What did you do, Mr. Garrett?" I grabbed her. She tried to scream, but I covered her mouth. We struggled. She was stronger than I expected. She fought hard. My truck was right there. I got her into the passenger side. She was crying, begging me to let her go. His voice cracked. I drove to a place I knew, an old access road in the hills. It was dark, no one around. Chen waited. The room was absolutely silent, except for the hum of the recording equipment. "I hurt her," Garrett whispered. "I did not mean to kill her, but she kept fighting, and I lost control. Afterward, I panicked. I buried her there in the hills. Then I drove her car back to Route 49 and staged it to look like she had broken down. I thought I had been careful. I thought no one would ever know." "Where in the hills?" Chen asked. "Where is Jennifer?" Garrett gave them directions, halting and vague. An old logging access road off Highway 32, about 10 miles east of Oak Valley. There was an oak tree with a split trunk near a dry creek bed. He had buried her shallow, covered the grave with branches and rocks. Over the years, the area had probably grown over, but he thought he could find it again if they took him there. Chen felt something like electric current running through her entire body. After 37 years, after all the dead ends and false hope, they finally had an answer. She looked at Garrett, this old man with trembling hands who had destroyed so many lives with his selfishness and violence, and felt a cold satisfaction. "You are under arrest for the murder of Jennifer Hayes," she said. The excavation team arrived at the location Thomas Garrett had described on a cold morning in late October 2022. The site was remote, accessible only by a rutted access road that had not been maintained in decades. Oak trees crowded close, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the autumn sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow. Detective Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the area, watching as forensic anthropologists and technicians set up their equipment, marked boundaries with yellow tape, prepared to dig into earth that had held a secret for 37 years. Garrett had been brought to the site in handcuffs, sitting in the back of a patrol car with 2 officers. He was frail and diminished in the daylight, nothing like the monster Chen had imagined during all those weeks of investigation. He pointed to a spot near the split oak tree, his hand shaking. "There," he said. "I think it was there." Chen had nodded to the team, and they began the careful process of excavation, removing soil layer by layer, sifting everything, photographing each stage. The dig took 3 days. Chen stayed at the site for all of it, sleeping in her car when exhaustion forced her to rest, drinking coffee from a thermos that never seemed to stay hot. She called Carol Hayes on the first day to let her know they were searching, that they had reason to believe they would find Jennifer. Carol's voice on the phone had been steady, eerily calm. "Thank you," she said. "Just please let me know as soon as you find her. I have been waiting so long." On the afternoon of the 3rd day, one of the anthropologists called out. They had found bone, and then more bone, and then the unmistakable shape of a human skeleton emerging from the dark soil. Chen walked to the edge of the excavation pit and looked down. The remains were incomplete, scattered by time and the movement of earth and the activity of animals over decades. But they were there. Fragments of clothing still clung to the bones, and beside the skeleton, tarnished and green with age, was a necklace with a small pendant in the shape of a heart. Chen photographed everything from the edge of the pit, then stepped back to let the forensic team work. They would remove the remains carefully, document their position, collect every fragment of bone and cloth and any other evidence that might have survived. The process would take hours. Chen walked back to her car and sat in the driver's seat with the door open, her hands shaking now that the moment had finally come. She called Carol Hayes. "Mrs. Hayes," Chen said when Carol answered. "We found her. We found Jennifer." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long Chen thought the call had dropped. Then she heard Carol take a breath, shaky and wet with tears. "Where is she? Can I see her?" "The remains are with the forensic team now," Chen said gently. "They will be taken to the medical examiner's office for identification and examination. Once that is complete, they will be released to you for burial." "Thank you," Carol whispered. "Thank you for finding my baby." The forensic identification took 2 weeks. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Jennifer Marie Hayes, 18 years old, who had disappeared on July 13, 1986, after leaving a graduation party. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull and strangulation. The medical examiner estimated she had been dead for approximately 37 years, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance. Chen drove to Cedarfield to deliver the official news in person. Carol Hayes answered the door looking smaller than Chen remembered, as if the relief of finally knowing had collapsed something that had been holding her upright all these years. Amanda was there too, having flown in from Portland when she heard they had found the remains. Mother and daughter sat together on the couch, while Chen explained the findings, the identification process, the release of the remains for burial. Carol listened with her hands folded in her lap, tears streaming silently down her face. When Chen finished, Carol asked the question that had haunted her for 37 years. Did she suffer? Was it quick? Chen had been prepared for this. "The medical examiner believes it happened quickly," she said. "It is impossible to know for certain, but there is no evidence of prolonged suffering." It was not entirely true, but it was true enough, and it was the kindness Carol Hayes deserved after decades of not knowing. Some truths were too cruel to speak aloud. The community of Cedarfield reacted to the news with shock that quickly gave way to anger. Thomas Garrett had lived among them for 37 years. He had been their neighbor, had attended community events, had been a familiar face at the grocery store and the post office. People remembered him now with new eyes, reinterpreting every interaction through the lens of what they now knew. He had seemed quiet, maybe a little odd, but nothing that raised alarms. How could they not have known? What did it say about their town, their community, that a murderer had hidden in plain sight for so long? The local newspaper ran daily updates on the case. Television news crews set up outside the courthouse, outside Garrett's house, outside the Hayes home, until Chen had to ask them to give the family privacy. True crime podcasters descended on Cedarfield, interviewing anyone who would talk, turning Jennifer's story into content. Chen hated all of it, the spectacle and the exploitation, but she understood it was the price of justice in the modern age. Thomas Garrett was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and concealment of a homicide on November 15, 2022. He appeared in court for his arraignment in a wheelchair, looking even more diminished under the fluorescent courtroom lights. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty despite Garrett's confession, arguing that the confession had been made under duress and that his client's advanced age and declining mental state made him incompetent to stand trial. The prosecution argued that Garrett's mind was sharp enough. He had remembered where he buried Jennifer Hayes. He had recalled details from 37 years ago with clarity. He had hidden his crime successfully for decades, which required planning and forethought. The judge agreed. Garrett was competent to stand trial. The case would move forward. The trial began in March 2023 in the Solano County Superior Court. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Rebecca Ortiz, a formidable woman in her 50s who had built her career on violent crime cases. She presented the DNA evidence, the boots found in Garrett's shed that matched the partial print from 1986, the recorded confession. She called Detective Chen to the stand, then the forensic anthropologist who had excavated Jennifer's remains, then the medical examiner who explained the injuries that had killed her. Carol Hayes attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table. She was 79 years old, her health visibly declining, but she did not miss a single session. Amanda sat beside her, holding her mother's hand, watching her mother's face for signs that this was too much, that they should leave. But Carol never left. She listened to every piece of testimony, looked at every photograph presented as evidence, stared at Thomas Garrett with eyes that showed no forgiveness. The defense attorney argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that genetic genealogy was an unproven science, that the confession had been coerced from an elderly man in declining health who might have confessed to anything to end the interrogation. He presented no alternative theory of the crime, called no witnesses, simply tried to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. It did not work. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. In the interim, Garrett remained in custody at the county jail. housed alone for his own protection. The sentencing hearing was brief. The prosecution requested life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defense asked for leniency based on Garrett's age and health, suggesting he be allowed to serve his sentence in a medical facility. Judge Sarah Martinez listened to both arguments, then turned to Carol Hayes. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "would you like to make a victim impact statement?" Carol stood slowly, Amanda helping her to her feet. She walked to the podium, her hands gripping the wood to keep herself steady. She did not look at Garrett. She looked at the judge, at the jury, at the crowded courtroom. "My daughter Jennifer was 18 years old when Thomas Garrett murdered her," Carol said. Her voice was quiet but clear. She had just graduated from high school. She was planning to attend UC Berkeley in the fall. She wanted to be a teacher like her father. She had friends who loved her, parents who loved her, a younger sister who looked up to her. She had a whole life ahead of her. Carol paused, gathering herself. "For 37 years I did not know what happened to her. I did not know if she was alive somewhere, if she was suffering, if she was thinking about home. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone, I wondered where she was. That kind of not knowing is its own form of death. It destroys you slowly, day by day, year by year. Now I know," Carol continued. "Now I can bury my daughter beside her father. I can say goodbye properly. But I will never get back those 37 years. I will never get to see what Jennifer might have become, what she might have accomplished. Thomas Garrett took all of that from her. He took it from our family. He deserves no mercy." Carol returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent. Judge Martinez looked at Garrett, who sat with his head bowed. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "you have been found guilty of one of the most heinous crimes a person can commit. You took the life of a young woman who trusted you, who thought you were helping her. You hid your crime for 37 years, allowing her family to suffer in ignorance while you lived freely in their community. I can find no mitigating factors that would warrant leniency. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down. Garrett was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look back. Jennifer Hayes was buried on a Saturday morning in May 2023 at Cedarfield Memorial Cemetery. The service was simple, attended by more than 300 people. Former classmates came, now in their 50s, their faces lined with age and the weight of survivors' guilt. Teachers from Cedarfield High, retired now, came to pay their respects. Members of Carol's support group came, these families who understood loss and waiting. Detective Sarah Chen came, standing at the back in her dress uniform. Amanda stood beside her mother at the graveside, her arm around Carol's shoulders. The casket was small, holding the recovered remains and the few personal effects that had been found with them. The necklace with the heart pendant had been cleaned and placed inside, along with Jennifer's graduation cap that Carol had kept all these years. The minister spoke about loss and healing, about how Jennifer could finally rest, how the family could finally begin to truly grieve. Carol stood at the edge of the grave after everyone else had left, just her and Amanda and the cemetery workers waiting respectfully at a distance. The headstone was simple gray granite. Jennifer Marie Hayes, it read, 1968 to 1986, forever young, finally home. Carol placed her hand on the cold stone. "I never stopped looking for you," she whispered. "I never gave up. I hope you knew that. Wherever you were, I hope you knew I never stopped loving you." Amanda gently guided her mother away from the grave, back to the car, waiting in the cemetery drive. Carol looked back once, at the headstone and the mound of fresh earth and the flowers people had left. White roses, dozens of them, because everyone in Cedarfield knew those had been Jennifer's favorite. 6 months passed. Carol Hayes turned 80 in November 2023. Her health continued to decline, the diabetes progressing, her heart weakening under decades of accumulated stress and grief. But something had changed in her face, in the way she moved through the world. The terrible tension that had defined her for 37 years had finally released. She could breathe differently now. She still drove to the cemetery every Thursday, but she no longer went to Route 49. That ritual had ended. Jennifer was not lost anymore. She was home, buried beside her father, under the oak trees in Cedarfield Memorial Cemetery. Carol would sit on the bench near the grave and talk to her daughter, tell her about the week, about Amanda's daughters who were growing so fast, about the support group that continued meeting monthly, even though Carol had passed leadership to someone else. Detective Sarah Chen visited Carol in early December. She came with a box containing Jennifer's personal effects that had been held as evidence, now finally released. The purse and its contents, the graduation cap with the gold 1986 charm, the photographs that had been in Jennifer's wallet. Carol went through each item slowly, her hands trembling. She held the graduation cap for a long time, running her fingers over the tassel. "Thank you," Carol said to Chen. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for finding her." Chen felt her throat tighten. "I am just glad we could give you answers, Mrs. Hayes. I am glad Jennifer is home." After Chen left, Carol sat in Jennifer's room for the last time. She had decided, finally, that it was time to let go. Not of Jennifer's memory, but of this shrine that had held her captive for so long. Amanda was coming next week, and together, they would pack up the room, donate the clothes and books, keep only the photographs and a few meaningful items. The room would become something else, maybe a guest room for when Amanda's daughters visited. It was time to let Jennifer rest, and for Carol to rest too. Carol looked around the room one last time. The white eyelet comforter, the posters on the walls, the stuffed elephant that had witnessed so many mornings of one-sided conversation. "I can let go now," Carol said aloud. "You are home. You are at peace. I can let go." She stood and walked to the door, turned off the light, closed it behind her. In the kitchen, she made tea and sat at the table watching winter light move across the walls. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion. A story that had finally, after 37 years, reached its ending. In the Cedarfield town square, someone had planted a memorial garden for Jennifer, a small plot with a bench and white rose bushes that bloomed every summer. A plaque read, "In memory of Jennifer Marie Hayes, 1968 to 1986, and all those who wait for answers, may they find peace." The garden became a gathering place for Carol's support group. They met there sometimes instead of the library, sitting on the bench surrounded by roses, sharing their stories of loss and waiting and hope. Some of them would eventually find answers like Carol had. Others would wait forever, trapped in that terrible limbo of not knowing. But they had each other, and they had this garden, and they had the knowledge that they were not alone. Thomas Garrett died in prison in August 2024. He was 90 years old. He had served less than 2 years of his sentence. The death was attributed to natural causes, his health having failed rapidly after his incarceration. When Carol heard the news, she felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even anger. Just a hollow emptiness where vengeance might have lived if she had any energy left for it. Detective Sarah Chen continued working cold cases, driven by the success of solving Jennifer Hayes' disappearance. She used the same genetic genealogy techniques on other cases, finding answers that had eluded investigators for decades. She thought about Carol Hayes often, about the cost of not knowing, about the particular cruelty of loss without closure. Every case she solved was for the families left behind, for the people trapped in that terrible space between hope and grief. Carol Hayes died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in March 2025. She was 81 years old. Amanda found her when she called and got no answer, drove from Portland in a panic, let herself into the house with her key. Carol was in her bed, her face peaceful, a photograph of Jennifer on the nightstand beside her. The funeral was well attended. The support group came, Detective Chen came, former students of Robert Hayes came. Carol was buried beside her husband and daughter in Cedarfield Memorial Cemetery, 3 headstones in a row, under the oak trees. The minister spoke about a life defined by love and persistence, about a mother who never stopped searching, about finally being reunited with the family she had lost. Amanda stood at the graveside and thought about her mother's last years, how the finding of Jennifer had changed everything. Carol had been able to let go, to grieve properly, to find some measure of peace before the end. It was not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending nonetheless, and in a story like this, that mattered. The white roses in the memorial garden bloomed that summer as they did every summer, and the people of Cedarfield remembered Jennifer Hayes. Not just as the girl who disappeared, but as a real person who had lived and been loved, who had dreams and plans and a future that was stolen from her. The case became a part of the town's history, A cautionary tale and a story of persistence, of how justice sometimes came slowly but it came. And on Thursday afternoons, Amanda Hayes would sometimes drive down from Portland and visit the cemetery, sitting on the bench between the three graves. She would tell her mother and father and sister about her life, about her daughters who were doing well, about the ordinary details of days that accumulated into years. The not knowing had ended. The waiting was over. And in the quiet of the cemetery, surrounded by the sound of wind moving through oak branches, there was finally peace. Carol Hayes stood at Jennifer's grave on a cold morning in January 2025, 2 months before she would die. She was 81 years old, her body failing but her mind still clear. She placed white roses on the headstone, the same flowers she had left on Route 49 for so many years. But this was different. This was real. This was where her daughter finally rested. Detective Sarah Chen visited that same afternoon, found Carol sitting on the bench between the three graves. They sat in silence for a while, watching winter light filter through the oak branches overhead. "Do you think she knew?" Carol asked quietly. "All those years? That I never stopped looking?" "I think she knew," Chen said. Carol touched the headstone one last time before standing. The weight she had carried for 37 years had finally lifted. She could breathe. She could rest. And when her time came 2 months later, she went peacefully, no longer haunted by the terrible not knowing that had defined so much of her life. Some answers come too late, but they still matter. Justice delayed is still justice. And for Carol Hayes, after decades of searching, there was finally peace.